After a night at the boss's mansion, the maid wakes up to a surprise romantic note. Regina opened her eyes slowly, disoriented by the soft light filtering through the silk curtains that were definitely not hers. For a moment, she remained motionless, letting the reality of the situation gradually hit her. The room was spacious, decorated with a discreet luxury that contrasted drastically with her small apartment in suburban Boston. Memories of the previous night began to emerge like fragments of a dream. The heavy rain that had prevented her from returning home after finishing her shift at the Hamilton mansion, Mr. Richard Hamilton insisting that she stay in one of the guest rooms, her initial hesitation, and finally, her reluctant acceptance of the offer. Sitting down on the king-size bed, Regina noticed a cream envelope on the bedside table. Her name was written in an elegant handwriting that she recognized immediately, the same one she saw on the instructions left every morning by Mr. Hamilton. Her heart raced as her fingers trembled as she picked up the envelope. At 32, and having worked as a housekeeper at the Hamilton mansion for 5 years, Regina had always maintained a strictly professional relationship with her employer. Richard Hamilton, a 45-year-old widower, was a reserved man who rarely interfered in her routine, except to praise her work or leave specific instructions about the needs of his teenage daughter, Madison. Before opening the envelope, Regina closed her eyes for a moment, remembering their conversation the night before. For the first time in 5 years, they had talked as two people, not as employer and employee. The violet rain had created an intimate, almost surreal atmosphere as they drank tea in the library. Richard had talked about his late wife, about the difficulties of raising Madison alone, and about how Regina's presence had brought stability to the house in recent years. The contents of the note made her heart stop for an instant. "Regina, your presence brings light to this house in a way that I cannot adequately put into words. Last night, our conversation made me realize how much time I've wasted pretending not to notice what's in front of my eyes. I'd like to invite you to dinner tonight, not as my employee, but as the extraordinary woman you are. Kind regards, Richard." Her hands trembled as she put the note down. The complexity of the situation hit her like a wave. On the one hand, there were the years of professional dedication, the respect she had earned among the other employees, and her impeccable reputation. On the other, the feelings she had carefully suppressed all these years, convincing herself that they were just professional admiration. Madison, the thought of the 15-year-old came as a wake-up call. The girl had already faced enough difficulties with the loss of her mother. How would she react to a possible relationship between her father and the housekeeper? Regina had developed a special bond with Madison over the years, helping her with schoolwork, listening to her problems with friends, being a constant and reliable presence in her life. Regina stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the impeccable gardens that she supervised herself. The Hamilton mansion occupied a privileged plot on Beacon Hill, one of Boston's most exclusive neighborhoods. The contrast with her humble origins in a small apartment in the Bronx could not have been more striking. Her mind wandered to her own family, her mother, who also worked as a maid all her life, always warning about the dangers of mixing work with feelings. "Keep your heart protected and your dreams realistic," she used to say. Regina had followed this advice to the letter so far, building a respectable and independent career. The sound of footsteps in the hall brought her back to reality. She checked her watch, 7:15. The other employees would already be starting their daily activities. In 15 minutes, she should be in the kitchen, organizing the family's breakfast and distributing the day's tasks. But how could she just go back to her normal routine after that note? How would she look Richard in the eye during breakfast? How would she maintain her professional composure knowing that he saw her as more than just his housekeeper? Regina took a deep breath, smoothing out the uniform she always kept impeccable. Her whole life was based on order, structure, and propriety. This note threatened to destabilize all that. Still, a small part of her, the part that had always dreamed of something more, felt a thrill that she couldn't contain. She tucked the note carefully into her pocket, a weight that seemed much greater than the small piece of paper suggested. The next few hours would be a test of her ability to maintain professional composure while her inner world was in complete turmoil. Before leaving the room, Regina made her bed with the same precision as always, as if this familiar act could anchor her to the reality she knew. But as she closed the door to the guest room, she knew that nothing would ever be the same. The day ahead would bring decisions that would change her life forever, and she would need to find a balance between her heart and her responsibilities. Regina walked down the stairs of the mansion with measured steps, each step echoing the weight of her reflections. The note in her pocket seemed to burn through the fabric of her uniform, constantly reminding her of the decisions she needed to make. As she approached the kitchen, familiar voices brought her back to the reality of her daily responsibilities. Martha, the middle-aged cook who had worked at the mansion for more than 2 decades, was preparing pancakes, Madison's favorite breakfast. The aroma of melted butter and freshly brewed coffee filled the room. "Good morning, Regina," Martha smiled, but her gaze carried a barely concealed curiosity. "Interesting evening?" Regina felt her cheeks heat up. "The rain was too heavy to drive," she answered succinctly, immediately getting busy organizing the breakfast trays. Martha murmured, flipping a pancake with practiced precision. "Mr. Hamilton seemed quite concerned about your safety last night. I've never seen him so insistent that an employee stay." Before Regina could reply, teenage footsteps came running down the stairs, and Madison burst into the kitchen, her school uniform slightly disheveled and her blonde hair in need of attention. "Regina, you're still here," Madison exclaimed, her blue eyes, so like her father's, sparkling with joy. "Dad said you had to stay because of the storm. It was like a sleepover." Regina smiled gently, picking up a hairbrush that she always kept in the kitchen drawer for emergencies like this. "Come here, let me fix that hair before you're late for school." As she combed Madison's hair, Regina couldn't help but notice how the girl leaned on her naturally, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. 5 years of daily interaction had created a bond that went beyond the employee-employer relationship. "Regina," Madison began, her voice suddenly serious, "do you think my mother would be angry if I started calling someone else mother one day?" The brush stopped in mid-motion. Regina felt her heart racing, and through the reflection in the window glass, she saw Martha freeze over the stove. The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. "Madison, dear," Regina began carefully, "your mother will always be your mother, and I'm sure she would want you to be happy above all else." "It's just that," Madison hesitated. "I heard Dad talking on the phone last night, after you went to the guest room. He was talking to Uncle James about feelings and changes." Regina finished tidying Madison's hair with slightly shaky hands, trying to keep her composure. "Sometimes adults need to talk about complicated things," she replied diplomatically. Just then, Richard Hamilton entered the kitchen, impeccably dressed in his gray suit. His eyes met Regina's for a brief moment, charged with unspoken meaning, before he turned to his daughter. "Good morning, Princess," he smiled, kissing the top of Madison's head. "Regina, can we talk in my office before coffee?" Martha coughed discreetly, busying herself with the organization of the pancakes with suspicious intensity. Madison looked from her father to Regina with barely contained curiosity. "Certainly, Mr. Hamilton," Regina replied professionally. Although her heart was pounding, the walk to the office seemed simultaneously very short and interminable. Richard opened the door for her, a gesture he always made, but which now carried a different weight. "About the note," he began as soon as he had closed the door. "Mr. Hamilton," Regina interrupted him gently, "I need to be clear about something. Madison just asked me a very significant question about having another mother figure in her life. She overheard your conversation on the phone last night." Richard paled slightly, running his hand through the gray hair at his temples. "I didn't expect. She was supposed to be asleep." "Exactly," Regina continued, keeping her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Any decision we make doesn't just affect us. There's a vulnerable teenager involved, a team that depends on the stability of this working environment, and years of professional trust at stake." "Regina," Richard took a step towards her, "I'm not proposing anything irresponsible. My feelings for you have grown over the years, seeing your dedication, your integrity, your affection for Madison." "Please," Regina held up a hand, keeping her distance. "I need time to think. I can't just—" A knock on the door interrupted them. "Dad? Regina? I'm going to be late for school." Regina took advantage of the interruption to pull herself together. "We'll continue this conversation at another time, Mr. Hamilton," she said professionally, although her voice betrayed a slight tremble. As she left the office, Regina felt the weight of different responsibilities on her shoulders. The day had only just begun, and it already seemed like an eternity. As she went off to supervise breakfast, she knew that every minute of that day would be an exercise in balancing her heart and her duty. Martha was waiting for her in the kitchen with a cup of strong coffee and an understanding look that said more than words. Regina accepted the drink with a grateful smile, knowing that she would need all the strength she could muster to face the hours ahead. The rest of the morning passed in a haze of routine activities that Regina carried out almost mechanically, her body following the familiar movements while her mind oscillated between the present and the memories that the note had awakened. The Hamilton mansion, normally a symbol of order and stability in her life, seemed to vibrate with a different energy, as if the very walls could sense the impending change. After supervising Madison's departure for school, with Richard deliberately keeping his distance, busy with phone calls in his office, Regina found momentary refuge in the library. This had always been her favorite place in the mansion, with its floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves and the natural light coming in through the tall windows. It was here that, the night before, everything began to change. While organizing some books that Madison had left lying around, Regina allowed her mind to wander back to 5 years ago, when she first walked through the gates of the Hamilton mansion. She vividly remembered the job interview with Richard, who at the time was still in heavy mourning over the recent death of his wife. Madison, then just 10 years old, was hiding behind the curtains, watching the new candidate for housekeeper with suspicious eyes. "I thought I'd find you here," Martha's voice interrupted her musings. The cook entered the library carrying a tray of tea and cookies. "You've barely touched breakfast." Regina smiled faintly. Martha always had a sixth sense for moments of emotional turmoil. "Thank you, but you needn't have worried." "Ah, dear." Martha sat down in one of the leather armchairs, indicating for Regina to do the same. "After 20 years in this house, I've learned that sometimes you have to worry about exactly who says you don't." Regina gave in, sitting down and accepting the cup of tea Martha offered her. The familiar aroma of Earl Grey brought a moment of comfort. "Do you remember Catherine?" Martha asked softly, referring to Richard's late wife. Regina nodded. Although she had never met Catherine in person, her presence was still felt in every corner of the mansion, in the photographs on the walls, in the stories Madison told, in the little habits Richard kept up. "Catherine was a force of nature," Martha continued, her eyes lost in memories. "She turned this mansion from a house into a home. When she fell ill, she made Richard promise not to let sadness consume the family. But most of all, she made him promise that when he found love again, he wouldn't let it slip away out of fear or social convention." Regina felt her hands trembling slightly around the cup. "Martha, I'm not saying this to put pressure on you," Martha interrupted her gently. "I'm saying it because I've seen how this house has changed in the last 5 years. I've seen Madison smile again. I've seen Richard regain his peace. And that didn't happen by chance, Regina." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made the two women straighten up. Richard passed through the library door, stopping momentarily at the sight of them. His eyes met Regina's briefly before he mumbled an apology and continued on his way. "He's as nervous as you are," Martha commented with a small smile. "I've never seen him so distracted since he met Catherine." Regina placed her cup on the tray with studied care. "It's complicated, Martha. There are so many considerations, so many risks. Life is complicated, dear, but sometimes we make it even more complicated by trying to control every possible outcome." Martha stood up, picking up the tray. "Do you know what Catherine used to say? Love doesn't ask permission to enter, it just happens. Our choice is only whether to open the door or keep it locked." After Martha left, Regina remained in the library, letting the cook's words settle in her mind. Her eyes wandered to a photograph on the wall. Richard and Catherine on their wedding day, young and radiant. Next to it, a more recent photo showed Madison on her last birthday, blowing out the candles with Regina by her side, both smiling. The sound of her phone brought her back to the present. It was a message from her mother, asking how she was. Regina hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. How could she explain the complexity of her current situation? How would her mother, with her warnings about maintaining professional boundaries, react? A movement in the garden caught her eye. Through the window, she saw Richard walking alone among the rose beds that Catherine had planted years ago. His posture, normally so controlled, revealed a vulnerability that made her heart squeeze. Regina took the note from her pocket, rereading the words that had changed everything. Each letter seemed to carry the weight of unexplored possibilities, of uncertain futures. The paper was already slightly crumpled from the many times she had held it during the morning, as if looking for answers that only her heart could give her. The morning progressed, and with it the need to start preparing for lunch. In a few hours, Madison would return from school, Richard would emerge from his office, and life at the mansion would take its apparently normal course. But beneath the surface of routine, powerful currents of change were in motion, and Regina knew that sooner or later she would need to decide whether to swim with them or continue struggling to keep her feet firmly planted on the safe shore of familiarity. Putting the note away once more, Regina stood up, straightened her uniform, and walked towards the kitchen. Each step echoed with the weight of decisions not made, words not said, feelings that could no longer be ignored. The day was far from over, and she knew that before nightfall, she would have to find the courage to face not only Richard, but above all her own fears and desires. The afternoon progressed at Hamilton Manor, and Regina found herself organizing Richard's office, a task she usually performed on Tuesdays, but which today seemed to carry a different meaning. Every object she touched seemed to tell a story. The fountain pen he always used to sign important documents, the frame with Madison's picture on her first day at school, the crystal paperweight Catherine had brought back from a trip to Europe. The phone at her waist vibrated. It was a message from her mother answering her brief report on recent events. "My daughter, remember what happened to your Aunt Elena?" Regina sighed, recalling the family story her mother always used as a warning. Her aunt, who had fallen in love with her widowed boss in the 1980s, had ended up losing not only her job, but also her reputation in the community. "But times are different," Regina murmured to herself, her fingers unconsciously tracing the edge of the mahogany table where, a few hours ago, Richard had tried to express his feelings. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Martha, wearing a worried expression. "Madison's on the phone in the kitchen. She's crying." Regina immediately left what she was doing and followed Martha through the halls of the mansion. She found the kitchen phone off the hook, Madison's embittered voice coming from the other end of the line. "Regina?" The teenage voice sounded shaky. "Can I come home now? I'm not feeling well." "What happened, honey?" Regina asked, her protective instinct automatically activated. "Emily Stewart was saying things about you and Dad. She said that her mother saw you talking in the library last night, during the storm. In that—" Madison stopped, choking back a sob. Regina felt her stomach sink. The Hamilton mansion was in an exclusive area of Boston, where neighbors often turned each other's lies into the subject of salon conversation. "I'll pick you up right away," Regina replied firmly. "Wait at the desk." After hanging up, she met Martha's worried eyes. "I need to warn Mr. Hamilton," Regina said, her professional voice masking the turmoil inside. "He's on an important video conference," Martha informed her. "But you're Madison's secondary legal guardian on the school register. You can pick her up without additional authorization." Regina nodded, grateful for Richard's foresight in having her registered as Madison's guardian for school emergencies. She grabbed the keys to the mansion's spare car, the same one she used to take Madison to appointments when Richard was busy, and set off for school. During the drive, his mind wandered to all the times he had played an almost maternal role in Madison's life. Evenings helping with school projects, conversations about early teenage crushes, shared moments decorating the Christmas tree. He had built this relationship carefully, always respecting Catherine's memory, always keeping the professional line clear. Now, everything seemed to be blending together in a way that threatened the delicate balance they had achieved. When she arrived at the school, she found Madison sitting alone on the entrance steps, her defeated posture contrasting with the imposing facade of the private school. When the girl saw her, she ran towards her and, for the first time in years, hugged Regina like she used to when she was younger. "Are they going to send you away?" Madison asked through sobs as they got into the car. Like Mrs. Peters? Regina felt her heart squeeze. Mrs. Peters had been the previous housekeeper, dismissed after a disagreement with Catherine shortly before her death. No, dear, I'm not going anywhere. On the way back, Madison alternated between moments of thoughtful silence and hesitant questions. Do you like Daddy? You mean, like that? Regina kept her eyes fixed on the road, her hands gripping the steering wheel. Madison, your family is very important to me. Any decision that involves your father and me needs to consider, first and foremost, your well-being. But what if? Madison hesitated, playing with the hem of her uniform skirt. What if I wanted you to stay? Not just as a housekeeper. Madison's words hung in the air of the car like an unfinished prayer. Regina parked in the driveway of the mansion, taking a moment before turning off the engine. Let's go in, she said softly. You need to get some rest, and then we can talk more about this, okay? In the foyer, they found Richard hurrying down the stairs, his face marked with worry. Martha told me you weren't well, Princess. What happened? Madison looked from her father to Regina, then muttered something about a headache and hurried up to her room. Richard tried to follow her, but Regina stopped him with a gentle gesture. She needs a moment, Regina explained, then briefly recounted the incident at school. She saw Richard's face gradually pale, the realization of the ramifications of his situation settling on his features. Regina, he began, but she gently interrupted him. Mr. Hamilton, she said, keeping her voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overflow. We need to think very carefully about the next steps. It's not just about you and me. It's about Madison, about her reputation, about the future of this family. Richard took a step towards her, but was interrupted by the sound of his phone. It was his law firm, calling about an emergency with an important client. Go, Regina said softly. I'll take care of Madison. We can talk later. As Richard reluctantly left for his office, Regina climbed the stairs towards Madison's room, each step seeming to carry the weight of the decisions that needed to be made. The note in her pocket, which had started everything that morning, now seemed to belong to another life, a moment of possibility before the complex reality of their lives imposed itself. The afternoon progressed at the Hamilton mansion while Regina sat on the edge of Madison's bed, watching the teenager who had finally fallen asleep after crying copiously. The room, decorated in soft shades of blue and white, still held traces of the little girl Madison had been. Teddy bears carefully arranged on a shelf, photographs of simpler moments pinned up on a wall. Regina gently smoothed the blanket over Madison, her heart heavy with the words exchanged over the last few hours. The girl had alternated between emotional outbursts and periods of contemplative silence, revealing fears and hopes that Regina had no idea she was carrying. You promised you'd never leave me, Madison had whispered before falling asleep, clutching Regina's hand as she did when she was younger. Just like Mommy promised. Those words still echoed in Regina's mind as she quietly left the room, closing the door carefully. In the hallway, she found Martha waiting with a worried expression. Richard canceled all the afternoon meetings, the cook informed her in a low voice. He's in the library. Regina nodded, feeling the weight of the note in her pocket as if it were made of lead. Martha, could you keep an eye on Madison? Of course, dear. I'll make that special hot chocolate for when she wakes up. The walk to the library never seemed so long. Each step echoed in the halls of the mansion, carrying the weight of the decisions that needed to be made. The walls, silent witnesses to so many moments over the last 5 years, seemed to watch her expectantly. Regina found Richard sitting in his favorite armchair, a glass of whiskey untouched on the side table. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment, he seemed more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. How is she? He asked, his voice laden with fatherly concern. Sleeping now, Regina replied, keeping close to the door. Richard, we need to talk. It was the first time she called him by his first name, and the impact of it didn't go unnoticed by either of them. Richard indicated the armchair opposite hers, and Regina accepted the silent invitation, sitting down with her back straight and her hands carefully folded on her lap. I've been thinking about Catherine all afternoon, Richard began, surprising Regina. How she always said that Madison had the gift of seeing through people, of understanding truths that adults tried to hide. Regina felt her throat tighten. Children always know more than we realize. Regina, Richard leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers with intensity. When Catherine was, in the end, she made me promise two things. The first was never to let Madison lose her ability to love openly. The second was never to let fear stop me from finding happiness again. And you think that justifies risking the stability we've built here? Regina asked softly. The trust of the employees, the respect of the community, Madison's emotional well-being? No, Richard replied, surprising her again. It doesn't justify risking it. It justifies fighting for something worthwhile, with care and respect for everyone involved. Regina stood up, walking over to the window. The garden outside was bathed in golden late afternoon light, Catherine's roses in full bloom. Do you know what Madison asked me today? If I would abandon her like her mother did. She heard Richard inhale sharply behind her. She's never expressed it that way before. Because she's never been afraid of losing me before. Regina turned to face him. For 5 years, I've built a relationship with your daughter based on trust and stability. If that changes, and if it doesn't, Richard interrupted her, standing up too. What if, instead of losing something, Madison gains the family she's afraid of wanting? Regina, you're already part of this family. This morning's note wasn't an impulse or a fantasy. It was a recognition of something that already exists. His words reverberated through the room, charged with truth and possibility. Regina felt tears forming in her eyes, but held them back with willpower. There's so much at stake, she whispered. Yes, there is, Richard agreed, taking a step towards her. And that's exactly why we need to get this right. I'm not asking for an immediate answer, Regina. I'm asking for a chance to explore this carefully, respecting everyone involved. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made them turn away instinctively. Martha appeared in the doorway, her face marked with concern. Madison's awake, she informed them. She's asking for you too. Regina and Richard exchanged a meaningful look before following Martha. On the way to Madison's room, Regina felt Richard's hand lightly touch her back, a gesture so subtle that it could have been accidental, but which sent waves of electricity down her spine. They found Madison sitting on her bed, her eyes still red from crying, but with a determination in her gaze that was very reminiscent of her mother. I've made a decision, the teenager announced as soon as they entered, her voice trembling slightly but firm. And you two are going to listen to me. Regina felt her heart racing, aware that whatever Madison said in the next few moments could change the course of all their lives. The note in her pocket seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, as if the words written that morning had set off a chain reaction that was now beyond either of their control. The setting sun cast long shadows across the room, marking the end of a day that had begun with a simple note and was now heading towards a conclusion that neither of them could have foreseen. Regina took a deep breath, preparing herself to listen to what Madison had to say, knowing that every word from the teenager would carry the weight of 5 years of shared history and a future that was still uncertain. Madison's room was immersed in golden evening light when she finally began to speak, her small but determined voice echoing in the expectant silence. Regina and Richard stood near the door, aware of the gravity of the moment. I've been saving some things, Madison began, pulling a shoebox out from under the bed. Things Mom left for me. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the box, revealing letters, photographs, and small, carefully preserved objects. Regina felt Richard stiffen beside her, clearly surprised by the existence of this secret collection. Madison took out a yellowed envelope, its edges already frayed from handling. Mom wrote this letter to be opened when I was ready to see Dad with someone else, Madison explained, her voice breaking. I found it 6 months ago, but I'd never shown it to anyone. Richard stepped forward, his voice hoarse with emotion. Catherine, she thought of everything. Madison nodded, unfolding the letter with reverent care. She wrote about how love doesn't diminish when it divides, it grows. She said that when Dad found someone special again, I should look not with fear of losing what we have, but with hope of gaining something new. Regina felt her own tears threatening to fall, but she stood firm. aware of her role in that delicate moment. Madison continued, now taking out a small photo album from the box. "Look at this," she said, opening to a particular page. It was a photograph from 3 years ago, the first Christmas after Regina started working at the mansion. In the picture, Madison was smiling broadly as Regina helped her decorate the tree. Richard was in the background, his gaze captured not on the tree, but on the two of them. "I kept this picture because it was the first time after Mom left that our house felt like home again," Madison explained, her voice gaining strength. "And it wasn't by chance. It was because of you, Regina." Martha, who had remained discreetly in the hallway, quietly entered with a tray of hot chocolate, placing it on the bedside table before leaving, closing the door softly behind her. "I'm scared," Madison admitted, hugging a worn teddy bear, a present from Catherine, afraid that everything will change, that people will say bad things, that it might not work out. "But I'm even more afraid that you two will let happiness slip away because of me." Regina finally moved away from the door, taking a seat on the edge of the bed. "Madison, your happiness is our priority. Nothing will happen to jeopardize that." "But that's what you don't understand," Madison exclaimed, surprising them both with her vehemence. "My happiness doesn't lie in keeping everything exactly as it is. It's in seeing the people I love being true to themselves." Richard approached, taking a seat on the other side of the bed. "When did you get so wise, princess?" Madison smiled through her tears. "Mom always said I had a heart that saw beyond appearances." She took Regina's hand with one of hers and her father's with the other. "And my heart sees how you look at each other, how you care for each other without realizing it, how much happier you are when you're together." Regina felt the weight of the note in her pocket lesson for the first time that day. Madison's words, added to Catherine's letter, seemed to dispel the shadows of doubt that had haunted her thoughts. "There's one more thing," Madison continued, taking one last item out of the box, a delicate pearl brooch. "Mom wrote that this brooch should be given to the woman who brought love back to our family. She said I would know when the time was right." With trembling hands, Madison held out the brooch to Regina, who felt her heart stop for a moment. "Madison, I can't." "Please," the teenager insisted. "It's not about replacing Mom. It's about honoring what she wanted most, our happiness." Richard watched the scene with tears in his eyes, his hands still intertwined with that of his daughter. The moment carried the weight of 5 years of shared history, of losses and gains, of fears and hopes. Regina accepted the brooch with reverence, aware of the profound meaning of the gesture. "I promise to honor your trust," she said softly, her words directed as much to Madison as to Catherine's memory. "So," Madison said, a small smile playing on her lips, "about that dinner Dad mentioned in the note." Richard laughed softly, the sound breaking the emotional tension of the moment. "You really don't let anything go, do you?" "Well," Madison replied, her smile widening, "someone needs to help you too make things right." Regina felt a warmth spread through her chest, not just from the love she felt for that family, but from the realization that maybe, just maybe, the universe had conspired to bring something extraordinarily beautiful out of painful circumstances. The sun had fully set now, casting the room in soft shadows. Martha knocked discreetly on the door, announcing that dinner was served. It was time to face the world beyond that protected moment, but now they would do it together, strengthened by the truth of their hearts and the unexpected blessing of a teenager wise beyond her years. Regina carefully tucked the brooch into her pocket, next to the note that had started that transformative journey. The words written that morning now seemed like a prelude to something much greater, not just a new beginning, but the continuation of a love story that transcended time and circumstance. Night had fallen over the Hamilton mansion when Regina, Richard, and Madison came down for dinner. Martha had prepared a special feast, as if she had sensed the importance of the evening. The dining room table, normally reserved only for formal occasions, was set with the family's finest china. "I thought the occasion deserved something special," Martha explained with a complicit smile, as she served the asparagus soup that Richard loved so much. Regina sat down in her usual place, but something was different. For the first time in 5 years, she didn't feel like an employee sharing a meal with her bosses. It was something deeper, more meaningful. Catherine's brooch, tucked carefully in her pocket along with the morning note, seemed to pulsate with an energy of its own. "So," Madison broke the silence, alternating glances between her father and Regina, "can we talk about the elephant in the room?" Richard almost choked on his soup, while Regina couldn't contain a small smile. Madison's adolescent frankness was refreshing after a day of so many contained emotions. "Madison," Richard began warningly, but his daughter interrupted him. "Dad, after everything we talked about upstairs, I think we can be honest here, don't you?" She turned to Regina. "Are you going to accept his dinner invitation? I mean, not this dinner, obviously, but the one on the ticket." Martha, who was entering with the main course, pretended to busy herself with the cutlery to hide her smile. Regina felt her cheeks heat up, but kept her composure. "Madison," she began softly, "things aren't so simple. There are many considerations." "Actually," Richard interrupted her, surprising everyone with his firmness, "they're simpler than we're making them out to be." He put down his cutlery and looked directly at Regina. "We've spent the whole day dancing around something that, deep down, we all already know." Regina felt her heart race. The atmosphere in the dining room changed subtly, charged with anticipation. Madison practically vibrated in her chair as Martha discreetly withdrew, closing the double doors behind her. "Richard," Regina began, but he held up a hand gently. "Please let me finish." He took a deep breath before continuing. "5 years ago, when Catherine left us, I thought I'd never find that kind of connection with anyone again. I wasn't looking for that. I was just focused on raising Madison and keeping our family going. But you came into our lives, and day after day, you brought back something we had lost." Madison took Regina's hand across the table, her eyes shining with restrained tears. "She's right, you know," the teenager said softly, "about how you changed our house." Regina felt her own tears threaten to fall. "You've changed my life too," she admitted. "But there are so many complications. The social difference, my position here, what people will say." "People will always talk," Richard replied with a gentle smile. "They already do. As Madison found out at school today, the rumors are already out there. The question is, are we going to let the fear of what other people think stop us from being happy?" Regina touched the pocket where she kept the brooch and the note, symbols of a past of love and a future of possibilities. "It's not just about us," she reminded softly. "Exactly," Madison interjected. "It's about all of us, and we're all here, now, agreeing that this is right." Richard got up from his chair and walked over to Regina. In a gesture that surprised everyone, including himself, he knelt down beside her. "I'm not asking for your hand in marriage, yet," he smiled as he saw her eyes widen. "I'm asking for a chance to do this right, to build something together, little by little, with respect for everything we already have and hope for everything we can be." Regina looked at Madison, who nodded emphatically, then at her own trembling hands resting on her lap. All the arguments she had built up during the day seemed to melt away in the face of the simplicity and sincerity of that moment. "Yes," she whispered, then more forcefully, "yes." The smile that lit up Richard's face was reflected in Madison's, who immediately jumped out of her chair to hug them both. Martha, who was obviously listening behind the door, entered carrying a bottle of champagne. "I was saving this for a special occasion," she winked, starting to pour the glasses. "Martha!" Regina exclaimed, between laughter and tears. "Did you know all along? Darling, I've been watching you two dance around each other for years. It's about time someone took action." Richard picked up his glass and raised it in a toast. "To our family," he said simply, his words carrying the weight of 5 years of shared history and the promise of many more to come. "To our family," everyone echoed, and Regina felt, for the first time that day, that all the pieces were finally falling into place. Madison insisted on taking a photo of the three of them together, using her cell phone. "To mark the moment," she explained, "the day we finally admitted what everyone already knew." As they posed for the photo, Regina thought about how a single day could change everything. How a simple note in the morning could trigger a series of events that would transform their lives forever. Catherine's brooch in her pocket no longer felt like a burden, but a blessing, a symbol of continuity and renewal. The evening was still far from over, and there was much to be discussed, planned, and decided. But at that moment, sharing smiles and champagne with the people who had become her family, Regina felt a peace she hadn't experienced for a long time. The fear of the unknown was still there, but now it was overcome by the certainty that, together, they would find their way. The next morning dawned with a different light in the Hamilton mansion. Regina woke up in her own room. She had insisted on going home the night before, despite Richard and Madison's protests. She needed this moment of solitude to process all the changes that had taken place in the last 24 hours. As she prepared for another day at work, her eyes fell on Catherine's brooch and Richard's note, carefully arranged on her dresser. It seemed impossible that only one day had passed since she had found that cream envelope on the nightstand in the guest room. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from her mother. "Daughter, we need to talk about your news." Regina had finally told her mother everything the night before, in a long phone call that alternated between tears and laughter. To her surprise, after the initial shock, her mother had shown an understanding she hadn't expected. "Times have changed, my child," her mother had said, "and more important than social conventions is the truth of the heart." Arriving at the Hamilton mansion, Regina found Martha already hard at work in the kitchen, preparing a specially prepared breakfast. "I thought we deserved something different today," the cook smiled, gesturing to a tray of freshly baked croissants. "Martha," Regina began, adjusting her uniform out of habit, "about this, how are we going to cope with the changes? With the team? With the routines?" "Darling," Martha interrupted gently, "do you think I'm the only one who's realized what's been happening over the last few years? Thomas, the gardener, has had a bet going for months about when you two would finally admit your feelings." Regina blushed intensely, but was interrupted by the arrival of Madison, still in her pajamas, something that rarely happened on weekdays. "I'm not going to school today," she announced. "Dad called the principal last night and explained that we needed a family day." "As a family?" Regina repeated softly, the word carrying a new and significant weight. "Yes," Richard replied, entering the kitchen wearing casual clothes instead of his usual suit. "We have a lot to talk about and plan. And," he hesitated briefly, "there are some people I want you to meet." Regina felt her stomach knot. "People?" "My sister Claire is coming from New York," Richard explained. "And James, my best friend and family lawyer, is also coming for lunch." They were very close to Catherine and, well, their opinion is important to me. "For us." Madison took Regina's hand. "Aunt Claire will love you. She always says that Dad needs someone to make him smile again." Martha discreetly began to organize a more elaborate breakfast tray. "I'll serve it in the living room," she announced. "I think you two have a lot to discuss." As they settled into the comfortable sofas, Regina felt a strange mixture of comfort and dislocation. For 5 years, she had served breakfast in this very room. Now she was being served, sitting next to Richard while Madison nestled between them. "Before Claire and James arrive," Richard began, his voice soft but determined, "we need to establish a few things. Regina, I don't want you to leave your job here. Not yet. I know it sounds strange, but it's part of who you are," Madison added. "It's how you look after us. Only now it'll be different." Regina felt tears forming in her eyes. "How are we going to make this work? People will talk." "People already talk," Richard smiled, taking her hand. "What's important is how we choose to live our truth. Catherine taught me that life is too short to live by other people's expectations." The sound of the doorbell interrupted the conversation. Martha appeared in the doorway. "Claire's home early," she announced with a knowing smile. Regina made a point of getting up, her professional instinct taking over, but Richard gently kept her seated. "No more," he whispered. "Not like that." Claire Hamilton proved to be a female version of Richard, the same piercing blue eyes, the same warm smile. She entered the room like a hurricane of positive energy, hugging Madison and her brother before turning to Regina. "So you're the woman who finally brought my stubborn brother back to life," she said, pulling Regina into a surprisingly affectionate hug. "Catherine talked about you, you know. In the last few weeks, she mentioned to the new housekeeper that she had something special. Regina felt her heart squeeze. She talked about me? She had a gift for seeing into people's hearts, Claire confirmed, sitting down and accepting a cup of coffee from Martha. And she was right about you. Just seeing how Madison blossoms next to you, how Richard smiles when you're around. Aunt Claire, Madison interrupted with typical adolescent frankness, do you think Mom would approve? A meaningful silence fell over the room. Claire studied her niece for a moment before replying, Darling, your mother wanted more than anything for this family to find happiness again. And looking at the three of you now, I can say with certainty that she would be smiling. Regina touched Catherine's brooch in her pocket, feeling its comforting weight. The morning was just beginning, and there was still much to be discussed, planned, and faced. James would be arriving soon, bringing practical and legal issues to consider. There would be adjustments to be made, routines to be redefined, roles to be renegotiated. But looking at Madison nestled between her and Richard, at Claire with her warm smile, at Martha discreetly making sure everything ran smoothly, Regina felt a certainty settle in her heart. This was her family, not by obligation or circumstance, but by choice and love. The note that had started it all was still in her pocket, along with Catherine's brooch, symbols of an honorable past and a promising future. The next few hours would bring more challenges and revelations, but for the first time, Regina was completely at peace with the path that was unfolding in front of her. The arrival of James Campbell, the Hamilton family lawyer, brought a more formal atmosphere to the mansion. With his impeccable suit and worn leather briefcase, he greeted everyone with the familiarity of years of acquaintance, but his keen eyes studied Regina with particular interest. Catherine talked about you a lot, James commented over lunch, which Martha had prepared with special attention. In recent weeks, she often mentioned how Madison seemed to flourish under your care. Regina, who was still slightly uncomfortable with these references to Richard's late wife, adjusted Catherine's brooch on her dress. She had changed out of her uniform earlier, after Claire's gentle insistence. It's still strange to hear about these conversations, she admitted. It shouldn't be, Claire interjected, helping herself to more salad. Catherine was always extraordinarily perceptive about people. She saw connections before they were even fully formed. Madison, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. Mr. James, the people at school, they're saying things about Dad and Regina. How are we going to deal with this? James put down his cutlery carefully, exchanging a meaningful glance with Richard before answering. Madison, in situations like this, transparency is our best ally. I've already prepared a formal statement for the school, and we're organizing a small reception to officially announce your father's relationship with Regina. A reception? Regina felt her stomach knot up. The idea of facing Boston's high society as something other than the Hamiltons' housekeeper made her deeply anxious. Nothing too formal, Richard assured her, sensing her apprehension. Just a few close people, members of the school board, some key neighbors. James suggests we'd better control the narrative from the start. Regina, Claire leaned forward, her expression serious. You need to understand that your life is going to change significantly, not just inside this house, but in how the outside world will see and treat you. It's already changing, Madison commented, fiddling with her cell phone. Ashley, my best friend, just texted me. Apparently, the Beacon Hill Mothers Club is already buzzing with rumors. Martha, who came in with dessert, couldn't help but smile. Rumors always run faster than the truth in this neighborhood, she commented, serving an elaborate apple pie. What we need to decide now, James continued, accepting a slice of pie, are the practicalities. Regina, you mentioned wanting to keep your job for the time being? Regina nodded, feeling everyone's gaze on her. At least initially. This house, the work I do here is part of who I am. I don't want people to think I'm changing who I am because of this relationship. Admirable, James commented, but we'll need to make some legal adjustments. First, your employment contract needs to be modified to reflect your new dual position. Second, we need to establish clear guidelines about your authority in the house, both as an employee and as Richard's partner. What about school? Madison asked. Will Regina still be able to attend parents' meetings as my guardian? With even more authority, James smiled. In fact, I suggest that Regina start participating more actively in the school's social events. This will help with the transition of her public image. Regina felt Richard take her hand under the table, a silent gesture of support that helped her maintain her composure. "What about the staff?" she asked, thinking of the mansion's other employees. "I've already taken care of that," Martha intervened proudly. "We had a little meeting this morning, while you were in the garden with Madison. Everyone is extremely happy, and, I might add, not a bit surprised." Claire laughed openly. "Apparently, we were the only ones who didn't see the obvious happening right under our noses over the last few years. The important thing now," James resumed, consulting some documents in his briefcase, "is to establish a timetable for these changes. I suggest we start with the resection next week, followed by a gradual transition of Regina into her new role." "New role?" Regina repeated, the reality of the situation beginning to weigh on her. "But I'm still myself." "Exactly," Richard said for the first time in several minutes. "That's why you're perfect for this family, Regina, because you understand that new roles don't mean losing who you are, but expanding who you can be." Madison abruptly got up from her chair and hugged Regina, taking everyone by surprise. "You'll always be the Regina who helped me with my science project and who knows exactly how I like my hot chocolate," she whispered. "Only now we don't have to pretend we're not a real family anymore." Claire discreetly wiped away a tear, while James smiled approvingly. Martha started to collect the plates, but Richard gently stopped her. "Please, Martha, sit down with us," he asked. "You're as much a part of this family as anyone here." The cook hesitated only a moment before accepting, and Regina felt her heart expand with affection for all those people. Her life was changing dramatically, yes, but the core of what made that house special remained the same. The love that united them, in all its different forms. "So," James checked his watch, "should I start preparing the official documents?" Regina looked at Richard, then at Madison, and finally at Catherine's brooch on her dress. "Yes," she answered with a certainty that surprised even herself. "It's time to make official what our hearts have known for so long." A week had passed since the revealing conversation in the dining room, and the Hamilton mansion pulsed with a different energy as the preparations for the official reception drew to a close. Regina watched the movement of staff through the window of her new office, a space that had previously been used as a music room in which Richard had insisted on turning into his personal territory. "So that you have a place of your own," he had explained, "where you can be both Regina the administrator and Regina the—" He had hesitated, smiling. "Well, we're still defining your titles." The sound of heels in the corridor announced the arrival of Claire, who entered carrying several bags from well-known brands. "Don't even think about refusing," she declared before Regina could protest. "Catherine always said that clothes are armor for social battles, and tonight you'll face your first big battle in Beacon Hill society." Regina touched Catherine's brooch, which now rarely left her side. "I still feel like an imposter sometimes," she admitted, "like I'm living someone else's life." "You're not," Madison declared, entering the office still in her school uniform. "You're finally living your own life to the full." She threw herself into one of the soft armchairs, a habit that showed how comfortable she already felt with the changes. "Ashley said that half the school will be here tonight. Apparently, we're the most interesting subject since the Petersons' divorce." Martha appeared at the door, carrying a tray of tea. "The caterers have just arrived with the flowers," she informed, "and Richard is on the phone to James, finalizing the last legal details." Regina nodded, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility, now not just as a housekeeper, but as the future mistress of the house. The last few days had been a delicate dance between her various roles, overseeing the reception preparations, helping Madison with a history project, supporting Richard in domestic decisions, and above all, learning to navigate her new social position. "I got an interesting email today," Madison commented, playing with the edge of her pleated skirt. "From Mrs. Stewart, Emily's mother." Regina felt her stomach tighten, remembering the incident at school. She apologized for Emily's behavior and asked if she could still come to the reception. Claire raised an eyebrow. "And what did you say?" "That forgiveness and grace are values I learned at home," Madison smiled, looking meaningfully at Regina. "From both my mothers." Regina felt tears forming in her eyes. She still wasn't used to hearing Madison refer to her in this way. Every mention was like a precious gift. Claire discreetly offered a handkerchief, while Martha smiled approvingly. "People will talk," Regina said softly. "They'll judge, they'll question." "Let them talk," Richard interrupted from the doorway, having arrived silently. "Our family isn't defined by other people's expectations." He moved closer, gently kissing Regina's forehead. "James has just confirmed it. All the documents are ready. After tonight, it will be official in every way." "Every way?" Madison asked, her eyes shining with curiosity. Richard smiled, exchanging a complicit glance with his sister. "Well, maybe I have one or two extra announcements planned for tonight." Regina felt her heart racing. But before she could ask, Claire pulled her towards the shopping bags. "Time to get ready," she declared. "Martha, we'll need your expertise with Regina's hair." The next few hours passed in a blur of preparations. Regina watched through her bedroom window as the guests began to arrive. Luxurious cars pulled up at the mansion's circular driveway, dropping off elegantly dressed people she knew only from sight or from Richard's stories. "Are you ready?" Claire asked softly, adjusting the midnight blue dress they had chosen. "The Hamilton color," she had explained. Regina touched Catherine's brooch, now complemented by a delicate pearl necklace that Richard had given her that morning. "Will I ever really be ready for this?" Catherine asked the same question at her first social event as Mrs. Hamilton, Claire revealed. And do you know what she discovered? That being ready isn't about feeling confident, it's about being true to yourself. A soft knock on the door revealed Madison, looking stunning in her first, grown-up, party dress. "Daddy's waiting at the foot of the stairs," she announced, then ran to hug Regina. "You look beautiful." The moment of descent came too quickly. Regina could hear the voices of the guests in the main hall, the soft clink of champagne glasses, the discreet music of the string quartet. Each step towards the main staircase seemed to carry the weight of her transformation. Richard was waiting for her, just as Madison had said, looking as dapper as ever in his tuxedo. His eyes lit up at the sight of her, and at that moment, all Regina's doubts seemed to melt away. "Ready?" he asked softly, offering his arm. Regina looked at Madison, who smiled radiantly beside her, at Claire with her encouraging smile, at Martha, who watched proudly from the kitchen doorway. Finally, her eyes landed on Catherine's brooch, shining softly against the blue fabric of her dress. "Yes," she replied, her voice firm for the first time that day. "I'm ready for our new dance." As they walked down the stairs together, Regina felt every role she had ever played in that house. Housekeeper, confidant, friend, mentor, merge into something new and complete. The murmurs of the guests grew as they appeared, but she barely noticed them. Focused on the feel of Richard's hand in hers, Madison's proud smile, the growing certainty in her heart. This was her home, her family, her life, not by accident or circumstance, but by choice and love. And as Richard guided her to the center of the ballroom, Regina knew she was exactly where she was supposed to be, dancing to her own music to the rhythm of a love that had grown slowly, naturally, inevitably. The night was just beginning, and with it, a new chapter in their lives. But now, finally, Regina was ready for every page that was to come.